U.S. President Donald Trump publicly rejected all the conditions discussed in Anchorage with Vladimir Putin and stated that it is time to put pressure on Russia to end the war. And it looks like we're entering a new round of negotiations again. Trump's turnaround was influenced by Ukraine's campaign of long-range strikes on Russian territory. And now, Axios reports that U.S. President Donald Trump spoke about increasing pressure on Russia during the G7 summit in France. He even allowed for the possibility of abandoning the understandings in Alaska allegedly reached in his talks with Vladimir Putin. The point is that Trump no longer sees the need for Ukraine to obediently give up its territories to the Russians. Trump says that the situation has changed and that doing so is now even dangerous. It is reported that at the G7 summit, Trump expressed dissatisfaction with the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin and even hinted that he is ready to abandon his old beliefs. Against this backdrop, the head of the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Hakan Fidan, unexpectedly stated that Ankara is ready to once again provide a platform for the delegations of Ukraine and Russia to resume the diplomatic process of resolving the war. And it's important to remember that in almost 2 weeks, Ankara will be hosting the NATO summit. At the same time, experts have calculated that in June, Ukraine carried out a record number of airstrikes on Russian military-industrial complex facilities. The main targets were factories producing missiles, electronics, and ammunition. Western analysts say Crimea is becoming a burden for Vladimir Putin, like a suitcase without a handle. Today, the Wall Street Journal writes that when the Russian leader Vladimir Putin annexed Crimea in 2014, this event was seen in Russia as the return of a jewel and a valuable asset. However, now instead of a historic achievement, Crimea is becoming a burden for Vladimir Putin, a vulnerable spot that could jeopardize his ability to continue the war. Although in 2014 he dramatically seized Crimea, telling Russians that the Black Sea Fleet was there so that there would be no NATO bases against Russia, in the end, the Black Sea Fleet has long been gone from Crimea, and now even Russians are fleeing from there. My name is Alexei Pichi, and let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and leave any comment under this episode. So, the American publication Axios writes that the Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicle system is highly effective and sophisticated. It has disabled oil refineries, changed the balance of power on the battlefield, and for the first time in 4 years of fighting, made some Russians finally feel the consequences of the war on their own territory. Against the backdrop of high confidence in Ukraine and Russia's difficulties in supplying fuel to cities and providing troops with supplies, Ukrainian President Zelensky announces the start of a 40-day operation to influence Moscow in order to force Putin to sign a peace agreement. A few hours after Zelensky's statement on Thursday, one of the largest drone attacks of the entire war followed, targeting 12 regions of Russia as well as occupied Crimea. And now the Russian authorities have announced the interception of at least 660 Ukrainian drones. There are reports of explosions at a chemical plant, for example, in the Tula region, but not in St. Petersburg. And all this happened a week after a powerful explosion at the largest Moscow oil refinery in Kapotnia, which filled the sky with black smoke. And as Axios writes, according to reports, residents were taking shelter in basements, and when they came out in some parts of the city, they were met by black rain. The plant eventually stopped its operations and will not restart until 2027. At least 3 more. Russian oil refineries came under attack this week, among other things. Zelensky's statement about a 40-day operation suggests that even bigger attacks are ahead, and now I'll quote Zelensky. If Ukraine suffers, then your Moscow will burn. Russia has many difficulties. And all because Vladimir Putin refuses to stop the war and listen to our proposals for a meeting, for genuine negotiations, and an honorable peace. Vladimir Putin, for his part, insists on Russia's supposed readiness for peace talks, but only on his own utopian terms. Earlier this month, he admitted that strikes by Ukrainian drones are causing some damage. But he stated that they will never be able to divide Russian society. Here is a quote from Putin. Strikes on civilian infrastructure. What are they aimed at? They are aimed at destabilizing society, creating a sense of uncertainty regarding the actions of the Russian armed forces. But apparently the balding old man feels something. He understands where everything is heading. This is where it gets interesting. The President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, who met with Volodymyr Zelensky at the G7 summit last week and before that had a phone conversation with Vladimir Putin, noted that Ukraine is currently, quote, doing quite well in the war. As Albert from Axios writes, two officials who were present at the G7 summit stated that Donald Trump expressed dissatisfaction with Vladimir Putin, whom he referred to as the bald dwarf, and even hinted that he might abandon the anchor agreements, according to which the US supposedly accepted Russia's demands that they would control Donbas as part of any deal. Remember those talks where Putin wanted Donbas and US recognition of Crimea as Russian, and Trump was allegedly willing to agree, but apparently that wasn't enough for the Russians, and they eventually admitted it. That's it. And as one of the Axios sources stated, quote, Trump was skeptical about everything related to Vladimir Putin and talked about putting pressure on Russia. But other leaders don't believe that Putin will actually do anything. Allegedly, he demanded that US-led diplomacy put pressure on Russia, but other leaders don't believe that he will actually do anything. The point is that US-led diplomacy wants to control Donbas. Because of the combination of the war with Iran and the disappointment after the failure of several previous rounds of negotiations, Trump apparently expected quick results, but that didn't happen. And now the whole calculation is that a massive campaign of strikes against Russia will give new momentum to the peace negotiations. On the other hand, some analysts believe that although this increases pressure on Moscow, it may also strengthen the conviction among Russians of the need to fight Ukraine and therefore to achieve victory over it. They think, since it comes from there, that's where we need to fight. Yes, don't be surprised. These are Russians. I mean, there's absolutely no logic there at all. They might now realize something is flying over Moscow, but they don't remember how it began. And accordingly, for them, the cause and effect relationships start from this point. At the moment, the consequences of Ukraine's long-range strikes are most noticeable in the territories occupied by Russia and in Crimea, where the authorities have suspended fuel sales and on Friday declared a state of emergency. Ukraine has struck power plants in Crimea and transportation hubs connecting the peninsula with Russia. And now Bloomberg agency is noting that Putin's war against Ukraine is turning against Russia in Crimea. Power outages are already leaving thousands of Crimea residents without running water, and many Russians are complaining that they can't even leave. They can't leave the peninsula because of the ban on fuel sales at gas stations. And even Sevastopol is not immune to difficulties after the strikes on the power system this week, which caused water supply pumping stations to go out of order. So the local utility company has sent out water tankers to supply residents with water. And now it's clear that while Russian forces are suffering huge losses on the battlefield, Ukraine is conducting an increasingly effective campaign of drone and missile strikes on Russian territory, damaging oil refineries and other key infrastructure, including in Moscow. This is leading to growing fuel shortages and increasing economic pressure related to funding the war. And here I should remind you that it was the annexation of Crimea that strengthened Vladimir Putin's support in 2014. But now the strikes on Crimea are hitting two key elements of the Kremlin's internal narrative. These are Crimea is ours and Putin means stability. But now there are already doubts. For reasonable people, for someone who is adequate, doubts would arise. Is Crimea really ours? And is everything really stable under Putin, or are there actually problems? So far, Putin has said almost nothing about the difficulties in Crimea and the waves of strikes on Russian territory. Recently, he held a meeting of the Russian Security Council to discuss, as he put it, internal security and stability. In addition to strikes on military targets in Crimea itself, Ukrainian forces have attacked a number of bridges on routes used by Russia from the occupied south of Ukraine, aiming to cut off the peninsula's supply chains. The latest attacks have also targeted ferries and warehouses near the Kerch Bridge, as well as trains and trucks, in order to disrupt supplies from Russia. As a result, the so-called Crimean Bridge is increasingly becoming the only viable link between Crimea and Russia. Here's where many people ask, why aren't we attacking the Crimean bridge? Well, apparently so far Ukraine is not trying to bomb the Crimean bridge, which gives rise to speculation that Ukraine is not really Ukraine. It just wants to create such difficult conditions on the peninsula that Russians will take the opportunity to leave precisely through this Crimean bridge. Ukraine is showing quite a humane attitude toward the occupiers so that they themselves pack up their things and leave for their unwashed wild Russia. And here's the paradox. Russia has practically no effective ways to counter Ukraine's actions to isolate Crimea. Ukraine has significantly weakened the air defense system of the Russian armed forces in Crimea, after which it began systematic strikes on vulnerable points, logistics, fuel, energy, and so on. Over the past 6 months, the number of strikes by Ukrainian medium-range drones on Russian logistics, supply depots, command posts, and equipment has increased almost tenfold. And the day before, Zelensky announced that he had also approved a 40-day influence operation against Russia aimed at forcing Russians to end the war. I'm curious how they're squirming in their chairs in the Kremlin when they hear things like this, that it's an operation to force the savages into peace. And against the backdrop of the Kremlin preparing for the State Duma elections in September, the Ukrainian push on Crimea, and the growing discontent of Russians with the war, all this risks undermining the central thesis of Vladimir Putin's social contract with his electorate. We've already talked about this. It sounds very simple. Stability in exchange for political support, or for Russia. In other words, you don't bother us, we don't bother you, and we let you work steadily, earn money, and so on. And you just don't get involved in politics, silently vote for Putin and united Russia. And that's it. But this narrative is a little bit undermined. Nevertheless, some analysts warn that this will not necessarily lead to political backlash and may even, on the contrary, strengthen public support for Vladimir Putin. Why? Well, Russians are so stupid, and I would even say dumb, that they might actually believe the theory that only Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin can protect them, forgetting that he was the one who set all this up. And against this backdrop, the publication Agentstvo calculated that Ukraine carried out a record number of airstrikes on Russian military-industrial complex facilities in June. The main targets were factories producing missiles, electronics, and ammunition. The most recent known target was the Titan Barricades plant in Volgograd, which was attacked on Saturday. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed that the Ukrainian armed forces struck this plant in Volgograd, specifically with the new FP5 Flamingo missiles. The information about the plant being hit is also confirmed by OSINT research. This facility is critically important for the Kremlin because it designs and manufactures launchers for the strategic Yars, Topol-M and Sarmat systems, launcher systems for the Iskander-M tactical complexes, and even components for Russian Orekha missiles. In just the first month of summer, at least 13 Russian defense industry facilities were hit, and overall, this is the highest number for the entire year. If we're not just talking about the plant in Volgograd, among the other targets hit this month are missile and electronics manufacturing facilities. This is the Progress Enterprise in Michurinsk, producing control systems for aviation and missiles. NIIR Progress in Cheboksary makes antennas for Kaliber and Iskander missiles. Another target was a facility making ammunition for these missiles. Another target is the Progress manufacturing plant in Ryazan's Michurinsk, where aviation missile systems are produced. It's called Azot in Novomoskovsk, which was attacked twice because it produces components for explosives. Shipbuilding was also targeted. The Zaliv plant in occupied Crimea was hit by drones where 2 military vessels were damaged. And now analysts note that such a large-scale campaign by Ukrainian forces aims not only to cut off logistics to Crimea or create a fuel shortage, but also to systematically reduce Russia's overall military capabilities. And against this backdrop, the head of Turkey's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Hakan Fidan, stated that Ankara is ready to provide a platform for delegations from Ukraine and Russia to resume the diplomatic process of resolving the war. Here is his quote. We want the Russia-Ukraine war to end as soon as possible through dialogue and on the basis of international law. At this stage, we see that the diplomatic process has stalled, the fighting has gained momentum, and both sides are focused on achieving military gains. The diplomatic process needs to be reactivated as soon as possible. In this context, I want to state to the international community, just as we have already informed both sides, that we are ready to bring the delegations of Russia and Ukraine back to the negotiating table in our country. Fidan also touched on the topic of the NATO summit, which will be held in Ankara on July 7th and 8th. According to him, this summit will be historic, and in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine, the issue of developing the defense industry will become one of the key topics. Next is another quote from him. Especially together with the Russian-Ukrainian war and other wars. At the political and strategic levels, there has been an awareness of the need to assess the level at which NATO countries are in the field of defense industry. This topic has already become a matter of strategic importance. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.